thinking about, Michelle?
Well, I was thinking about um, trust. I mean, I guess it's the topic I kind of come back to sometimes, but I was thinking about it in light of actually like how do we teach and learn? Because there's kind of there's it's sort of an unspoken thing, I think. I mean, I'm sure it's like really there heavily in like the pedalo. I'm
Pedagogy.
forgetting the word now. Yeah,
Is it
pedagogy. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, like where there's a talking about like maybe creating a trust or rapport with students, da da da, but there's something like that I think sometimes can be forgotten about trust and its important role in like the teaching and learning process. um, because there's also trusting yourself to, like, for example, when it comes to sort of the things that people might pursue, um, and it shows up quite a bit like in the liminal web, you sort of have to trust that it matters, right? Like it trust that whatever you're leaning into in terms of studying or reading or whatever, that it matters. And you can't really do that in like the way that you kind of need to if you constantly like question yourself and question, like, there's a healthy self-skepticism, of course, but there's also where you're paralyzed by your questioning of yourself, where you just say, well, I don't know, and I don't know that I can trust this compelling feeling, and so I'm not going to do it. But really, if you did, it might lead in certain directions. So yeah, I don't know. I think there's just something there. I guess I'm just thinking again about trust and how much what it really requires, because for if we think about it from the place of like hoping that somebody learns something, the first question would be like, well, first of all, why do you want them to learn that? Why do you want them to learn in the first place? And then second of all, like, do you trust that they will? And even if they don't, that maybe they were meant to learn something else.
Mm.
But what it really what really impedes upon all of that openness is, just standards, right? And like institutional standards, and I'm not to say those are bad at all. I'm just saying that it's very challenging to keep that place of openness and trust and let it, basically let that flow and that process occur at its organic rate. If you're thinking, well, I need to learn to read by X age, or I need to learn to, or whatever it is, I need to teach how to read by X age. And I mean, it's, again, there's a place for learning those skills. I'm not downing that. But it's just interesting how we don't often like, it's difficult to have those. I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to think about how those two bow together.
Mm.
Then again, maybe you have to have a trust that imposing a standard is okay too. Like that can maybe require a trust as well. So it's not like those are antithetical. But anyways, those are just some things that are like, bubbling up in my brain.
No, I think
Good
that's
to see you, Andrew
fascinating.
and
And
Daniel.
Andrew Parsons, how are you doing, Mr. Parsons? You doing all right?
Yeah. I was just I gotta work. I'm on call, so I just figured I'd tune in and listen up. But yeah, I'm doing good tonight. Just
Outstanding.
driving around working.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir. Well, we appreciate you stopping in. It means a lot, and always a pleasure, Mr. Parsons. Michelle was just
Yeah.
mentioning kind of this tension of trusting a kid to learn something, standards, all of these kind of tensions. We also had mentioned a bit, there's that Astra Taylor idea of unschooling, and if you don't even have to school kids, they can kind of teach themselves. Astra Taylor is quite fascinating on that. So we have been mentioning the unschooling of Astra Taylor. And there's Jacob Kashir. Look at that beautiful man. Ah, look at that guy. And Paul's making his net appearance. So hello, Paul. So she was mentioning unschooling with Astra Taylor, which is a very, it's an old conversation, but it's quite fascinating. And there's interesting data that shows that basically, there's some data that shows literally not doing anything, just leaving kids alone can be better than public school. Like literally just leaving them can be better than public school. But then there are also questions of, is that different? When Astra Taylor is writing there, for example, when she's growing up unschooled, there's not necessarily unlimited YouTube. There's not dopamine. There's not an algorithm, right? She talks about watching a zillion episodes of The Simpsons, and eventually that gets bored. But is it now different because of the media landscape where you have to be a little more like it may be different? from what I can tell, what seemingly is a very good educational model, which then I think has implications for all leading and influence and so on and so forth, seems to be some sort of mixture of, some people call it the aristocratic education, modeling extreme one-on-one, but you're modeling something and then creating the environment where the kid can teach themselves, for example. So it's very light school, you could say, but there's a deep understanding that the environment is a big factor. And you have to think about that. And then the parent does it. Like one of the things, too, that we always talk about, parents want their kids to read, but if the kids never see the parents reading, why would the kid do it, right? It's like, oh, because you're supposed to read. Oh, okay. Yeah, well, that as soon as they can get away from that, they're not going to do it anymore. So there's something about modeling. And I guess, and then feel anyone can comment on anything. I guess a thought I had as you were speaking, Michelle, I mean, basically, I think systems and institutions exist precisely to remove fear, to remove questions of trust. Because basically, if a kid is in a school, the teacher doesn't actually have to trust the student if the student doesn't do their work, well, they fail, right? It kind of removes trust, right? And also, it kind of removes fear because this is the curriculum. This is what we do. I don't need to be afraid if it works or not because this is the curriculum, right? And so there's a way in which a system and institution, almost by definition, is that of which removes fear, anxiety, and questions of trust. What do you need to trust in? And then, of course, if you as a particular teacher or parent, if you say, well, I don't know if the school curriculum even works. And Clayton, good to see you, sir. Always a pleasure. Well, you can say, well, I can't change it, though, because it's the state, right? Or it's what all the other parents are doing. Oh, beautiful, Clayton. So there's this kind of idea where, I mean, basically, if we're going to start talking about the human being not being controlled by institutions, not being controlled by systems, it will necessitate reintroducing questions of trust, reintroducing questions of fear, reintroducing decisions and proportions, which again, if our entire lives we've been trained to associate those feelings with doing something wrong, then if we have those feelings, we must be, oh, well, this must not be the right direction, and you go back to some big other or some institution. But certainly I will say this, I mean, on those questions, and then anyone can say anything, I'll give it back to Michelle, is that there's a reason people went to institutions, is precisely to avoid fear, to avoid these things. And it's not that the institutions, I just think it's very important. It's not like the government, it's a Kafka story. It's not that the schools or the government necessarily said, how do we control everyone? It's that people in their freedom felt anxiety and then ran to the system to run from that anxiety, right? There's way more of that wanting, as Lacan said, you'll get your master, right? And so I think that's part, but let me give it to Michelle and then Mr. Parsons. Michelle, please.
Yeah, that's good. I'm glad you brought up Astor Taylor and those specific things because, there's kind of a question of how you, if you just kind of incubate the space, right? But the space has a portal to a technology that doesn't inherently have limitations. Then do you just still extend that trust, even though you could be potentially fostering a kind of I don't know, some sort of addictive behavior. I mean, addictive is a strong word, but technologies are slippery like that, because it's oh, well, I just, I use them for good stuff for my email or does that. So it's hard. But then the technology just becomes another appendage. So it's more difficult to call it out as oh no, that's kind of becoming a habitual default. And I need to be able to you talk about with Owen Daniel, be able to not have that, kind of have my armor up all the time. Hey, but yeah, I just think it's an interesting question because creating the environment is different. Everybody, it feel different to know how to create environments these days when you've got again most people have that little portal to the internet, which can be great because that's why we're all here, right? But it's also this endless little place of rabbit holes. And maybe that's fine. Maybe we can, think about it with Ebert's stuff, right? You just saturate on the rabbit hole of your Wikipedia, endless rabbit hole of whatever, I don't know, Princess Diana or something. And then you come out the other side. Hey, baby, I'm Shelly. But it's hard to navigate that with children, I'll be honest, because it's they're also children. You also don't, there's certain things you wouldn't just expose little ones to. So anyways, yeah.
No, I mean, that's outstanding on the Astrid, because I think that question on the Taylor unschooling with this possible infinite source of, that does the internet necessarily saturate as a certain point, right? Because it seems like previous technologies have a certain saturation point where you just get bored with it and you move on. But is the internet in its variety? I mean, that kind of is the question, right? Does the internet in its variety and movement between dazzles avoid ever having a point of saturation, which would mean that the technology itself does not automatically eventually lead to getting bored with The Simpsons, as Astra talks about, and moving on to an interest in videography, right? I mean, it's a very interesting question. And Michael, it's good to see you, so I'll give it to Mr. Parsons and then Michael. Mr. Parsons, please.
Yeah, I was just interested in the schooling, and so we're kind of a crazy house that we have my oldest and my youngest, we do homeschooling. And then my middle one, he goes to public school just because of his learning disability and stuff. But my oldest, I mean, he's 15 now, and he basically teaches himself. I mean, he literally, like in his spare time, he's just been reading trigonometry and math books. And you're just like, I mean, I don't like math at all. His mom doesn't like it, but he's taught himself, and his friends, I mean, he has kind of a cool little friend group that they get into it, and they have their, they also do gaming and stuff. But I mean, he's basically self-taught at this point. Like, he is taking college courses, and it's interesting because he's always just been able to do that. But my middle child, he is with his learning disability, but he is high strung energy, and he needs to play. Like, he needs to play a couple hours and get the energy out before he wears it down, and then he can focus in on something, he's got to be engaged. And it's just interesting. Yeah. Like you're saying, these personalities, and what system could map these two different, and then my third is a girl, and she's coming into, just, more girl stuff and being a little bit more, emotional, but she's very much into the arts and, doing theater and things like that. So and she's not so much into the school stuff. So it's and you have to keep her focused in the homeschool, and she'd almost maybe do better in a public school situation. So we're constantly toggling, like, oh man, maybe we should put her with more friends, because she's got friends in the neighborhood that go to public school, and she talks to them, and she gets interested. And so it's just an interesting, diverse thing that you can't really spell out. But I just thrown that in, my 2 cents, because just thinking about it. But
I think that's a magnificent contribution, because I think that's the truth of the matter, is where it can vary, right? Like, it could be for this kid, it's better to just have they self-taught. For another kid, they might thrive in a more school. But even again, the very having to think that thought is something that will be required of us, and considering those proportions and those judgments, if we don't want to, say, have our humanity replaced by AI or systems, and if we're talking about new communities, new social organizations require new levels of judgment and decision making. Like, it will move to negotiation. And you see, that's really important, because we can, in a way, I think, make sound magical or kind of idolize new social organization and decisions. But once you understand, well, then you are going to have to increase your tolerance for the anxiety of choice, the anxiety of freedom, like an Eric Fromm says. And actually, you're not going to have a blanket answer, because it could vary between the children, for example, or for the activities. Well, then there's a massive cognitive load, if you will, and a massive emotional load that's going to be put on people to actually make those decisions. And so you can understand why people let capital make decisions for them, or let the institutions make decisions for them, right? Which would all suggest the necessity of something that were to, say, regularly habituate and train people in those capacities of decision making. Which, please note, decision making is not a matter necessarily of IQ, if we're emphasizing on the anxiety of decision making itself, right? Like, we've kind of made, just because you're smarter or have an IQ, you're college educated. Well, that doesn't mean decision making is easier for you. Not at all. That's actually arguably a completely unrelated decision. And you could just argue that college educated people can be good at decisions because they can rationalize whatever the decision make and just blank out options and just kind of stick with whatever they think. So they avoid decision with intellect is a possibility, right? Or you can avoid decision with education, right? Because you just use your education to trust in the system, so you never have to think about it, as an example, and so you just plug in, right? So the ability to make decision, to live decision, to live with decision, to discern difference, these do not seem to be the same capacities that we teach in society, which is more of, you could say, on the side of information and intellect, right? I do wonder if it's a capacity. I sometimes think there's a difference between, say, literacy and information. Like, literacy is more of a skill, right? It's more of a capacity through which information enters, right? And we really focus on teaching literacy to people in school. But I wonder if capacities like decision making are more like literacy than information. They become skills through which information is related with, right? And things like scaling decision capacities might be very different than, can we scale everyone learning quantum mechanics or something, right? Like, we don't really ask, oh, well, not everyone's going to be, no one says, we may say not everyone's going to be interested in quantum mechanics, but we don't tend to say not everyone's going to be interested in literacy. Right? It's funny how we don't even do that, right? But why don't we do that, right? Because we just kind of, the baseline has risen. We're like, well, of course everyone can learn literacy. They may not, because they're in a society that doesn't teach literacy, but no one would say that there are some people that simply can't learn to read, right? That's been tied to very problematic racist movements and so on and so forth, right? But it's just very interesting because we would be quick to say that not everyone is going to learn quantum mechanics or something like that, right? But I wonder if the ability to make decisions is actually more on the side of literacy, and if we would actually do a lot better if we were to think about kind of incubating those sort of capacities in a school setting. But that all to say, I think what you're saying with your children, and then I'll give it to Michael here, is exactly the reality. It can vary. And the question I always have that I think is interesting, because it seems as if children do teach themselves some things, right? Some children will teach themselves to read, others will teach Legos, others will teach themselves how to do crafts, right? I would be very surprised if there is such thing as a child who has never taught themselves something, right? Like, never taught themselves something. Now, the things they may teach themselves is a video game, and we may say that's a waste of time, but please note, that still required some sort of teaching themselves how the game worked in order to operate, right? It's interesting to think if there has ever been a human being that literally taught themselves nothing at all, right? I would be surprised. And if that is the case, then we know that human beings have the capacity to teach themselves and even a natural tendency to teach themselves. The question is simply its incubation and its direction. And then the question becomes, is it the case that every human being at some point learns to be self-taught about something? Like, does every human being at some point learn to self-teach themselves about something? Like, that's a very general category, but I think that is an interesting question, because if you say yes to that, well, then it would be really useful to set up environments by which we could eventually realize that. No, maybe it doesn't show up till 5 or 32 or 48 or 24. But whatever that thing is probably where human beings, the highest likelihood of the extension of their humanity is going to be in that thing, right? But it's just interesting because I think we tend to say that because Grace teaches herself things that Haven doesn't, but Haven teaches himself things that Reed doesn't, and Reed teaches himself things that the other kids doesn't. And it's interesting to observe that, because I think it complexifies the question of the possibility of self-teaching. It would take a lot. I like that, Clayton. That's exactly right. It'd be really hard to teach no thing. But that's very interesting, because then also it suggests that really when we ask the question, can people teach themselves? Often we're asking it from the position of, will they teach themselves the curriculum we think they need to know by age 9, in the time by which we think they need to know it, right? So it's not really a pure question of, do people teach themselves? It's sort of with that lurking in the background. But let me pass it on to Michael. But I think what you were saying there is very important, Mr. Parsons. But let me give it to Michael here. Michael, thank you for being here, sir.
It's great to be here, as always. I don't know how exactly the conversation started, but this question around education, um, children, things like that. It's actually very topical for me because I went with my pastor and his kids to a Redwood National Park in California that I used to work at yesterday. And it was really interesting just to observe, like he has I think she's 8-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old son. It was really it was really interesting to observe them. Um, and I had worked with kids in this national park, and I've worked with kids a lot, so I've been able to observe kids in a lot of different settings. And it's just interesting to watch what kids find curious as opposed to what they don't find curious, and the things that you find interesting and express to them, and sometimes it feels like it lands on deaf ears, but then things that you don't think are interesting or important or whatever that that they find really interesting. And we were at this park, and there's this little booklet for kids. It can be for adults too, but primarily geared towards kids that you work through as you go through the national park. And because I knew a lot of the facts and things, I was helping them out with it. Um, and the older daughter, like every page, before even reading the instructions, she would like turn to her dad and be like, "Dad, like, what do I do here?" And she wasn't really showing that much like self-direction or self-initiation. But then we get in the car and we're driving past the Golden Gate Bridge, and her dad's like, "Oh, look over there, that's Alcatraz." And she's like, "Oh, what's Alcatraz?" And I was like, "Oh, it used to be this maximum security prison, da da da." And she's like, "Oh, has anyone ever escaped from there?" And I was like, "Yeah, I had been there a couple times with my supervisor who had worked there, and so I kind of overheard some escape stories, but honestly, it wasn't the most interesting part of the site for me. But for her, she was like so fascinated about this. She was like, "I want you to look up like escape stories. Like, I want you to tell me like all the people who have tried to escape." And so next thing I know, I'm on the FBI's website, and I'm telling her about, these three guys who like took 50 raincoats and sewed an inflatable raft and like drilled their way out of like the ventilation ducts. To talk about teaching yourself things, I doubt any of these people had done any of these skills before. Um, and she's just like so enthralled by this. Um, and then I end up uh, making a snafu where she asked like, "Oh, what are the nature of the crimes of the people who were here?" And I gave her a little bit too many details for her dad's liking. But it was just, yeah, it was just and just thinking, if that's like something that she's fascinated by, how many other 8-year-olds are fascinated by that, and how many teachers, if she came to them with like, "Oh, I am fascinated by this," would like be like, "Oh, no, 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 like that's not age appropriate," or that's of no use, like that's not interesting. um and like how to both like encourage children's like wild imaginations and like seemingly like unimportant, quote unquote, like interests of theirs, non-practical, as we talk about. um while still, if you're in like a public school setting, while still kind of adhering to some type of like boundary structure of like, these are the things that we feel are important to bestow upon our kids. Um, but I've been thinking a lot about lately too, like how important it is to learn how to learn, and to learn how to be a beginner. I think that actually takes a lot of training to actually learn learn how to be the type of person who can learn. Um, and like I just started taking Aikido lessons a couple days ago, and one of the most senior students, after the first lesson I was there, was like, Aikido is really about like learning how to be fully present and learning how to learn. Like he said, when he got his black belt, his his sensei told him, "Now you're officially a beginner." Like, which I love. It's like you getting a black belt is just like all that it's shown, the masters are this person is a committed learner, but like they haven't actually really, like they haven't actually really learned anything until, and he was saying until you really have to teach someone. Um, and another thing before I pass it back, like, he told me at the end of the lesson, he's like, if you're feeling any feelings of like you're holding everyone back by being new, by, not knowing how to do all these things, like don't feel bad because every time I have to teach, I learn and I know my practice more deeply. And he's like, no one complains about having to teach a baby how to walk or, how to do something that they already know how to do. So, I've just been getting a lot of insights about both like students and teachers and that dynamic.
No, magnificent. And as you were speaking, it reminded me of something that I in the car overhearing Alcatraz. I'm always fascinated how I actually think a lot of self-direction is a result of overhearing and stumbling upon. And the problem is that when you go to school, you're being told directly. And so what's very interesting, the reason why I think this is very important, and actually one of the reasons why I think the social coordination mechanism, the liminal web, what we are doing, what we see online is extremely important as this kind of living, breathing thought, unfolding of thought and all the different things, because because it allows the dynamic of overhearing. And I think this is actually very important. When the teacher says, you must learn math, then you find yourself in a situation where you're like, well, why? When am I going to use it, right? It's a kind of justification relationship, right? And you're also kind of like, oh, I need to learn, or I'll fail the test, or different things like that. And Prisha, always good to see you, sir. And so it's very interesting with that. If it's a direct thing, it's kind of like, well, convince me I need to learn this. Well, you can threaten me, or you can convince me. But if I'm sitting in the car and overhear the adults mention Alcatraz, huh? What's that? I can pop in. Well, notice here, Alcatraz or the adults are not trying to convince the kid at that point, why they need to learn this. The kid has heard something that is mysterious to them, that feels bigger than them, and they want to follow it, right? And this, I think, is very important because we've talked many times about humans seeming like learning and frankly, really finding ourselves as human beings is tied to this feeling of pursuing something like we don't see the whole of it. We catch a kind of glimpse of it. We sense it and we want to see where it goes, right? I really do think a lot of the mechanism by which people find the thing is that has more of an intrinsic motivation drive is a result more of overhearing, indirectness, and stumbling upon. Which again, the institutional structure is very direct. And again, then it has to convince the consumer, quote unquote, or it has to threaten the consumer. So the relation of the consumer or the participant is not one of all or interest where they're chasing something. It's one of how do I do this to the criteria I need to move on, right? And then I'll pass it to Clayton here. Whereas when you overhear something, huh? What was that? And also, obviously, what's interesting about overhearing is there was a whole lot of information that washed over you that just washed over you and went on, right? But there was some gold in that water that, here's the key. You yourself didn't even know you were interested in that. You yourself did not even know interested in Alcatraz because you didn't even know Alcatraz existed. But isn't that odd? That you almost have this moment of recollection of something you've never heard about before, right? And that's the minnow, that's the Play-Doh, that sort of memory. Well, this moment of feeling of going, with something you've never heard before, but isn't it weird that something you've never heard about before can catch your interest in the way that story does? Because surely there were many things she had heard that she'd never heard about before, but didn't grab her at all, right? It just kind of washed over, right? But this Alcatraz, that grabbed her, right? This is incredibly mysterious, why that is the case. And I think this mystery suggests the need of a few things. It would suggest vibrant environments where kids and human beings can overhear things, vibrant environments where we can stumble upon things. And then the mechanism by which the intrinsic motivation begins is this very odd recognition of something that's kind of odd why we recognize it or why it pops out to us. But that very mysteriousness means the methodology by which it comes over us, almost by definition, has to be indirect. It's going to be more indirect. It's going to be more incidental. And I don't, please note, I'm not saying this is impossible in a school environment. It's not impossible in a classroom. Seemingly, my experience was the secret seems to be a good English teacher. You have a good English teacher who will have conversations with you outside the text. There's something magical about that. But then to that point of not shutting down in the comments, shutting down the English. There's something about English, though. I do wonder if there's something about English that allows you to pursue curiosity more so than other fields, precisely because the answer is more open-ended, right? Whereas, say, in math or science, well, the answer is the answer until you get to the upper level research, or you have a good science teacher who actually knows, following a Paul Feyerabend-Getz method, that science needs that exploration. But that's a different topic. But let's put it this way. It seems more available to the English teacher to follow curiosity because if you're going to talk about Hamlet, it's not going to be just the plot. It's going to be something more if you're writing the paper, right? So there's something there that may allow the kindling of curiosity, because I'm always interested how many people, when you listen, it's like, so what made the difference? Well, I had this English teacher. Well, I had this English teacher. I had this English teacher. That's always fascinating to me. And it's something about, they saw that recognition of something that's mysterious in that it was recognized and they were able to pursue it. More needs to be said on that, but let me give it to the wonderful Clayton. Clayton, it is wonderful to see you. And then I'll give it to Jacob. Clayton, always a pleasure, sir.
Thanks, Daniel. And it's good to be here. Normally, we're in the middle of a cyclone where I'm speaking from. It's an ex-cyclone at this point. It's sort of like been downgraded, but strong winds and rain and all of that happening. So yeah, it's quite interesting, when you juxtapose that with curiosity and yeah, actually, I don't have power right now. So if my phone dies. But yeah, like coming back to curiosity, like a few things sparked up for me, like, when Michael was sharing about that child being grabbed by Alcatraz. And it seems for me like, two things that came to mind, like it's like thoughts as spirits. It's like thoughts have this spirit nature that sort of like they're trying to look for a resonance in a being that's alive almost. And when they make that acquaintance, they connect, right? It's like of everything that got thrown at this child, it's kind of like this Alcatraz thing that sort of like just sort of like managed to connect with something in them. And then a whole new, you'd say, I can't find another description. It's like other than the spirit, like a new spirit got formed out of that relation. And so then there was that whole creation of that new realm in a moment. And then all the questions about, how did the people get out? And you notice like the interest goes to the creative side, because like, how did creativity emerge that, led to the breaking of the structure that has been, designed to not be broken, right? And so that's quite fascinating for me. And so because of all that, like, it's so weird because it's as if like our interests are the one that capture us, as opposed to us kind of like manifesting them. It's like we sort of like carry around a potential to respond to things that may capture us, and then every now and then the things come and capture us. It's like we don't know what's going to capture us, but like you like to say, Daniel, to use your language, like we're always preparing, and a good education sort of like prepares you and gives you a whole lot of capacities to be able to respond. And I guess, to link that to the ability to respond, right? And so it's like when the thing manifests, when the phenomena happens, it sort of like attracts your ability to respond to it. And then when you when you're attracted in that way, all of a sudden you feel, response able, and then now you want to take the responsibility upon yourself to kind of like now respond because you've been inspired and it's been in you all this whole time, but you didn't know how to express. But now all of a sudden there's like an opening in reality that goes like, here, put it here, and then now there you go. And you can't explain it yourself. Like you don't know why it's coming out in that shape, but you know that's the right way it should manifest. And you can't articulate it. It's very and I think that goes to the articulation thing, because like, we've been overly like currently we're overly digitized. Everything is like very 1-0, but actually we operate in a very analog way. And analog is much more richer information, that it's much richer than zeros and ones, that you can't just articulate it in a simple way. You can act it out. It's like, I could describe to you, I could give you the procedure of how to tie shoelaces, but it would be way easier for me to just tie them so you can just see. Then you get all the information, as opposed to this 0-1, it's going to skip some details that I can't fit in the 0-1. And so, yeah, anyhow, those are some of the thoughts coming up from all of that. Yeah, I'll pass it back.
No, magnificent. And thank you for being here in the middle. That is a vibrant environment, a doom storm, et cetera, so forth. So we appreciate it. Also, I realized that today is daylight savings time. So this is basically 9:40. So it's a freaking party. And I always love daylight savings times, because when you do international calls, you realize how disastrous this is. Because some nations change, others don't. And whoever continues to enforce daylight savings time does not have children, because it takes a very long time to get them snapped back. Yeah, Clayton's like, frick. So anyway, I really appreciate what you were saying, and I'll give it to Jacob here. I know there's that idea, and Peterson will mention this, where Jung says that it's not that people have ideas, but ideas have people. I actually sometimes think motivation is like that. I'm not so sure. If you pay attention to the experience of motivation, it is almost, it's not so much that people have motivation, but motivation has people. Like the experience of motivation is very mysterious. Like when you are suddenly motivated by something, it's like you can't summon motivation. If I right now tell myself I want to be motivated, it doesn't really work, right? I can lift my hand, but if I'm like, I want to be motivated, it doesn't really work so well. It's like motivation kind of grabs you and goes from there. But there's this idea that like the experience of motivation is something that has you often more than you have it. It can kind of feel like, not always, but it can have that experience. And really then it's so much, again, I'm just very interested by this idea that it seems to be tied to your ability to be in a certain environment or a certain context that generates the motivation. Now, one way you can do that is by having a deadline or having pressure. That can create motivation. But notice that you then need a context that pressures you to make the motivation more than you motivate yourself. The reason why I think this is important is because if we're asking questions of intrinsic motivation, motivating human beings to do hard things, and all of these different things, then recognizing the seemingly very deep relationship between motivation and environment seems to be a very big deal. And it seems to be that motivation for learning is environments of overhearing, stumbling upon, surprise, vibrancy. And then, of course, you could say, if we have an overly pragmatic utilitarian society, then all our environments are kind of bland, maybe, brutalist. And so then kids or people aren't stimulated by something they oversee, which then we say, well, see, we have to force motivation. We have to force them to do stuff. But maybe that's just a self-fulfilling prophecy because of the way we create our environments where nothing can jump out to them. I mean, I'm always fascinated. If you take a kid into the forest, they're like fascinated on everything. Oh my gosh, where's the bird live? Where does the bug live? Like there's this interesting sort of vibrancy that can occur in the woods, right? Where you see this desire to learn and to explore. I'm always interested when the kids are in the city, what fascinates Reed are trucks, like things moving on the street more so than buildings. They're not like fascinated by tables or different things, but trees in the woods, they are. So I do wonder if there's something about high resolution experience, which would have to be expanded on, that seems to also increase the probability of this interest in something that has you and you don't even know why, and it's very mysterious, and then you follow it, which then I think ties a bit to what Jockin has been saying about nous and Aristotle, this mysterious apprehension that grabs you, that you don't calculate to, but that surprises you, that actually is the key fundamental characteristic of what it means to be alive and to be a living thing. That has a creative impact on society, on the world, versus just be causally, by cause and effect, moved through the world. Like for Aristotle, basically, nous is how you have an impact on the world, where with otherwise we're just calls through the world. We're just kind of taken by effects. We're not actually creatively participating in it, maybe a kind of Bergeian way. But I'll stop there and give it to Mr. Jacob Kashir. Mr. Jacob Kashir, it's a delight to see you, sir, and I hope you are doing well.
Yeah, well, what a pertinent and timely conversation at the net, as always. Anyway, we were very happy to have the snow day, obviously, because school sucks. Why does it suck? That's a really important question. Um, uh, I I really liked Michael's contribution. As I spoke to in the chat, I think that this is the key meta skill: how to be a noob, how to be a proactive noob, how to be a master noob. It's really important. I'm also experiencing that right now in a very variety of contexts, and I think we have a lot of trouble with over specialization, which is also supportive of ego and identity consolidation. So if you go, you do your BA, you do your MA, you do your PhD, you're very comfortable, you're very secure in that environment. But then if you go to the taekwondo, or you go to the salsa class, or you go to do some stand-up comedy, totally different. Like you're a zero, you're new, right? And yeah, that is the pathway to something like a holistic, kind of resonant, multidimensional person. And through the process of noobing in all those different areas, you kind of you have a meta exacted capacity to show up in uncertain circumstances in an improvisational way. I just joined the organizing team of a very cool conference that's happening at Harvard University on May 2nd called Education for Flourishing Metacrisis in a Time of Metacrisis and Second Renaissance. And it's being organized with some of the people from Life Itself in Europe. And it's a really pertinent occasion because it's a premier educational institution is hosting it, but it's going to have a mixture of people kind of in the traditional field and a little bit more sort of liminal web informed thinking. And like what is it that we need in order to address, respond to, proactively move through the meta crisis? And I think like beyond just like, okay, times are going to get very uncertain. You have to learn new skills. You have to be a teacher of yourself at learning skills using AI. And there's all these possibilities that open up. There's a way that Jordan Hall described in his recent dialogue with Guy Sengstock, which I thoroughly recommend. Can't remember the title, but it has something about holy war in it. And Jordan talks about becoming a kind of leader of change in the midst of an acceleration of change. And that the ones who can actually kind of set the tone of change can sort of steer the direction of the process of accelerating unfoldment that we are all, I would say, inevitably bound up in. So that's kind of what I'm wondering at this moment is like, what's the sort of overman of the meta crisis? You know, what is the going beyond oneself, where you're utilizing all these different tools that are available, you know, learning how to play with others and throw together like teams and groups to organize around certain principles. And I do think being part of a team is really valuable for me. You know, I'm all about self-motivation, and I think I've demonstrated that. But if I want to like get myself to really go beyond my natural capacity, I need to be part of a team. I need that group motivational field that supports even greater emergent possibilities. And that's intrinsically meaningful as well. So, how can we kind of create educational teams, learning exploratory processes that achieve goals in the world, but also have like a meta educational purpose encoded within them, so that we're kind of doing the thing and learning at the same time. Thank you.
Magnificent. Well, that's fantastic on the conference. And and I think what you're saying on the noob, that actually is pointing to many things. As we've talked about before, Ivan Illich is so much about how we exist in a disabled age. Like, we don't, why does the government have to be Big Brother if we're disabled from doing anything, right? You don't need a Big Brother. You don't need to manipulate people if there's a disablement that occurs. And this disablement can be simply because we use a mechanic to fix our car, so we never learn it ourselves. And also regulations make it to where if you open your car and you do something wrong, then you go to jail or something, right? So there's this kind of expert class that is created that contributes to disablement. And basically what you're then led to say is, well, it's like what you need to do is get good at one thing that everyone, if the cards of disablement will be shuffled in such a way that you will have value because the one thing that you can do, someone else will not be able to do and they'll come to you, et cetera, so forth, right? But the problem is that actually runs away from the idea of constantly being a noob, right? And trying something, yeah, that's right. Your car calls the cops on you. Exactly. With that. So there's this idea of like ever restarting that actually seems to be a deep spiritual practice, like doing something that you go back as a noob, because to be a noob at something at 32 or 42 is really hard. Because you also are like, I've already gone through this. There's a lot of work on the ego that would do. And Mr. Rivera, good to see you, and et cetera, so forth. But if you don't do that, well, then you're stuck in your lane. And also, that is going to necessarily make you fragile if you lose your position. If AI, this gets into where if AI takes jobs and different things, then you would be in a fragile position. But it is very like that ability to be excited about doing something new or willing to do something new or to step into something new. That does seem to be very, very important. And what always fascinates me is how children seem to be quite willing to do that. Like they'll just jump into things, right? Even if they shouldn't, they have this ability to just, well, I can get up and sing, I can dance, I can do jujitsu, I can do the read. They'll just kind of jump in, and as you get older, you become less likely to do that, less willing to do that. Maybe there's some wisdom there, but also there can be a certain danger that can occur. And I think that's interesting on the leader of change and acceleration, because almost, and I'll have to watch that. I did see that talk come up with Guy. I always enjoy Guy, Mr. Sinstock, and I'll watch that with Mr. Hall. And there's something where being a leader of change and acceleration of change would be you're able to become a noob again. You're actually able to restart, because an idea of if things can change so quickly, you may have to restart, right? Like acceleration and restarting actually kind of go together in a funny way, right? Because things can change so quickly that then you have to go back and redo something and retry something. And we just lost Christian when I was going to hand it to him. So that seems to be a really big issue. I think the other thing, there's a book called Grit by Duckworth. And he talks about, grit and how you form grit and things like that. And some things he does note is when you have these Olympic teams, these swim teams that are getting up at 4 a.m. and swimming in different things, that's really extraordinary. But a lot of the swimmers are like, well, if everyone else on your team is doing it, it just becomes kind of normal. You don't really think about it very much, right? If it's just you doing it, then it becomes difficult. And I'll give it to Christian here. But if everyone else is getting up at 4 a.m. to go swimming, it's just what you do, right? So there's something about the ability to coordinate with teams to do new things that actually then create a plausibility structure to support you. And the question becomes, how can we use technologies like this or education? Well, but this gets into where education is almost, you are competing with the other students for the higher GPA, competing for jobs. So then, competing for positions. So this would run against forming teams to do new things together or to help you restart different things, because also your mindset is a little bit more competitive. The only team you have is at work that you're already doing. To do something new would be problematic. But let me give it to Christian here. Christian, it's good to see you, sir.
Good to see you all as well. Oh, by the way, I was doing my first little deep dive into the work of the name, I believe is David Bentley Hart, and a great writer. and I was watching interviews and presentations he gave. In one of them, I heard a familiar voice, Daniel. I was like, I know that voice, this audience question. I didn't see your face, but I was like, that's obviously Daniel. So that was fun to have you pop up in my YouTube rabbit holing. I think about this question of specialization and generalization a lot, and it's well, it's interesting. I think a lot of us who are like interested in, let's say, meta type conversations tend to at least have a very generalized interest in things, if not a whole lot of generalized skill sets. We like to have like a full picture. We like to kind of see multiple angles and moving parts, and how does this domain interact with that domain. And maybe that's because well, there's probably different reasons. Different people have different motivations that are kind of intrinsic there. It might be that um, you're a bit of a completionist, right? And you're like, I need all of it. Give me all of it. I won't feel like complete. And if anything's missing, other people might just have a more intuitive kind of, yeah, let's just say intuition that um, that's just the nature of understanding things, is that there's a lot of perspectives. Uh, and then I, but then it's like, okay, well, what do you do with that? For me, it's at the very least, makes for very stimulating conversation, right? Like I feel, or a very stimulating education, right? I feel like I'm learning, and I've got one of those brains, like I think probably all of us here do, that loves to learn. Um, I love new perspectives, building out my map of the world and how it works and all of that, um, and trading ideas. Uh, but then when it comes to the question of like a meta crisis or meta problems, I think it gets a little trickier very quickly, because there's the question of meta solutions, or at least the solution to the meta problem. And then what exactly? What is it that we do? And I found, after being part of these conversations for a while, it's like this is an important conversation that we're having, and it's insufficient. Um, there needs to be all kinds of conversations, which would make sense given that it's a meta problem. You need a kind of meta solution. Um, it's likely not going to be all from one direction or under one kind of conceptual umbrella. Um, and so when I think at least about myself, and to some extent also like liminal web and all of that, um, I think it's almost like there is a kind of specialization of generalization, and which is interesting. And I think it's important, but to like name that for what it is. It's like it to be a real generalist in this sense is not just to like be interested in everything. It's like, but also you only have so much time in your life, right? You get to pick a few things that you could get extremely good at, or maybe a few more things to get kind of good at, or like, pick and choose whatever. So no one can just like be great at everything. So it's not like we can just create this master skill set that everyone adopts, or even that like a few people adopt, because you can't. You have to work within practical limits, which means you're going to have people with a diversity of skills and a diversity of specializations. Um, and you need some people to be extremely specialized in certain things, right? You need someone who spends literally their whole life studying plant genetics or something, so that you have that perspective and understanding how the biosphere interconnects with ecology, with economics, and blah, 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 right? So we can't do away with specialization. And in what I see, and I'll wrap up here, as what, just my opinion, but the most potent offering that um, folks in the liminal web-ish or adjacent spaces have to offer is not so much having a vision for what the future would look like, or a plan or anything like that, but more the ability to help, I guess, engender that noob or beginner's mind type of mindset amongst a diverse group of people, including specialists who are working within their domain of specialty, so that we can everyone's doing their work a little bit better and a bit more coherently with each other, right? And they're because I think Jacob's right in that when you are in a kind of not necessarily an echo chamber, but a groove, let's say, of your specialization, you tend to be around people who are of the same specialization. There tends to be a shared implicit or explicit doctrine about what is like the right way to think about things or approach things, or just whatever's just like implicitly normative there. You can get kind of stuck. I see it all the time, of course. So I see like a really important job to be done is to somehow get all the different people from their specializations learning how to kind of break their minds free of that, the normativity that comes along with their specializations. And how do you do that? And I think that it's the kind of, let's say, like social or psycho or whatever technologies or just whatever practices, it's not like some great magic trick that needs to be accomplished. I think a lot of the tools are already out there. I think it's more a matter of uh, working, experimenting with different techniques and how to implement those within an environment where you have a lot of the right people at a table. Basically, like, uh, I don't know, I guess there's probably a million ways to approach it, but my mind tends to go toward a kind of like working group conference or something like this, or let's say like kind of like ephemeral squads of people who are like, we're going to work together for 6 months, etc. Think tanky type shit, but with this added dimensionality that that the work process includes these ways of making us think in with beginner's mind, to put it succinctly. So I think that's kind of what came up for me, at least.
No, magnificent. Thank you for sharing that. And having people that would actually keep people in that beginning mindset can be extremely important when you're engaging in work, because you often can be in a lane or following certain assumptions you don't realize that are there, that kind of set you on a trajectory that is hard to escape once you're working on those assumptions, or if you don't have the ability to be supported as you enter into a new noob space, then it would be easier to quit or not to go through with that. I think that's very true. It's very interesting on what you're saying. On the generalist and the specialist, and I'll give it to Michael and Jacob here. There's a few things, and I like what you also said about the meta solution. There's this interesting book on polymaths. I believe it's by Peter Burke is the name. It's the history of polymaths. And a polymath, would be someone who obviously is studying a lot of things. Leibniz would be an example. And one of the things that he points out that I think is very interesting is how a lot of the people we remember, like Leibniz, I'll just use that because I love Leibniz. You say, oh, he's a philosopher. Well, you actually forget he was a specialist in China. He was working on like various sciences. He was all of these different fields, right? Obviously, if I mentioned Thomas Jefferson, you might say politician. Well, he's also doing agriculture and different things. And one of the things that Burke is, Peter is trying to point out is that a lot of the great thinkers were not specialists. They were polymaths, but they were remembered as being specialized. And you lose sight of this polymath tendency that they had going on. But what I think is extremely interesting about the polymath in this way, going back to what we were saying earlier, is, looking at a Samuel Johnson or different people, Vico, the way they read was more, in my opinion, just how they talked about it. It wasn't like this insatiable, yes, there was a little bit, I want to be an expert in everything, but it was almost more so I need to have a lot of things washing over me, so that something stands out, like we said at the beginning, so that I recognize something that I don't know I'm not recognizing that can only occur if I'm always washing things over me, right? And the idea of specialization, and really what was interesting in this notion of the polymath, and Peter will also say, he really talks about the age of the polymath more in the 1600s, and then he talks about the man of letters in the 70s. He's kind of following this history. But there used to be an idea in the age of the polymath where you actually couldn't be a specialist unless you had this process of things washing over you, because you didn't know the thing that would grab you, that would lead you to putting in the amount of hours and work and passion required for true specialness, like becoming a true specialty, right? And also what was very critical is there's this emphasis with the polymath of making sure that there's not a lack of ways by which one another's specialization can't wash over you. Like we have a problem now where we're specialized and they can't communicate that specialization to us, or people are kind of locked in their specialization, so it can't wash over us, right? There's a lack of ways to kind of really, in a sense, let people know what we do or how we think, right? And again, what's just very interesting is in this kind of idea of the polymath, is there's like the polymath. What I find so interesting about the way Burke is talking about the polymath is it's not merely a way to describe someone who knows a lot of things. It's a different way of learning that emphasizes being washed over by a lot of things because that is the environment of saturation in which something grabs you that then you pursue, right? As opposed to saying, oh, I want to learn architecture, I want to learn history, I want to learn philosophy. It's like, no. I don't even know what I want to learn unless I just wash myself over constantly with lots of ideas. And that creates the environment in which something can grab me. And then I know what I want to learn. You have to wash yourself over constantly to find the thing is that you actually want to learn, which is very odd because usually we say, no, you decide what you're going to learn based on what you want to learn. Here, it's almost like actually you can't know what you want to learn unless you're being ever washed over by all of these different fields, which then would suggest that we need a society, in that kind of way in which we have means of being perpetually washed over by ideas, because again, because that creates the possibility of overhearing something like Alcatraz. That creates the possibility of tripping upon something like, whoa, that's interesting, right? And one of the things I do think about with the liminal, what we're doing here, or the liminal web, or the social coordination mechanism, is rather than necessarily saying, okay, what should the tariff policy be or something like that, you're creating environments where you're creating means for people to overhear something. Or when I'm talking with y'all, I find myself overhearing something and going, oh, bam, right? Where you're creating a culture where there's a dialogue going on that someone may encounter and overhear something that then lights something up inside of them, right? And on this idea of the meta solution, which I think is a beautiful idea, personally, if there is some sort of idea of a mode of consciousness that is necessary for the meta solution, then there's something about this lighting up in people that then sets them on their own way. That seems to be very, very important. And it doesn't have to be in philosophy or history. It could light them up, make them interested in something and deal with forestry, right? But that environments where people can have things washed over them seems to be very important. Now, of course, you could argue, well, didn't the internet wash people away with information? Didn't it overwhelm them with information? So this is the question, where is there something though different about these kind of where people like us are having conversations that people can overhear and indirectly experience of a higher resolution kind of experience that also creates, the key to information is that it doesn't relevance realize, as Vervaeke would say, right? When you have a conversation like this, you're perpetually trying to determine what is fitting to say, what would be appropriate to say, what would be good to add. So there's a relevance, there's a evaluation that is occurring in the information that if you're just online may not be occurring. It might actually not be evaluation. It might just be what increases commodity, what increases clicks. And so the value is the clicks. Where here, there's a possible shifting notion of evaluation. And then someone like Layman Pascal will basically, with Gurdjieff, emphasize that the ability to evaluate is tied to what it is to be human. And if we can't do that, well, then we're going to be stuck in whatever lane we're in. And then, of course, if McGilchrist is basically saying, yeah, everything depends on your mode of attention, Ivan Illich, Simone Weil, this ability to give attention in the right way is, and that would be tied to evaluation as such, is that what is being on offer in these sort of exchanges that then people can indirectly overhear or experience, and that we can simultaneously do for one another, that actually is a certain training that brings about a certain character of humanity that we then defend and that we then stick to and don't let it so easily be replaced by AI or something like that. There's more to be said, but it was very interesting what you because the history of the polymath has been of great fascination to me, because it really does suggest that again, you become a specialist because you generally wash yourself over with things and then grasp something. It grasps you and you follow it from there, right? Very different from how we think of you should, let's put it that they're the polymath would not necessarily agree with the idea of follow your interest. They would say, no, you have to create an environment where your interest can pop out at you. And that requires this overflow, this certain saturation. But let me give it to Michael and then Jacob can share. Michael, please.
Yeah, I really like that idea of the saturating in the kind of, water of culture or something like that. Because I think there's a lot, there's an unintended pressure that I think kids and adults are put under when people say, find your interests, or find your passion, find what's passionate to you, and kids are like, I don't know. I don't know what I'm passionate about. And I'm not given the opportunity to explore that in the school system. And then after school, all my activities are hand-picked by my parents. So I don't really have, kind of the voluntary space to, venture into the woods and see what arises, see what reveals itself to me. And I often think that when kids are told that they're good at something, that can often spell the end of their interest in it. I've observed this with a lot of friends where people are like, oh, you're good at that sport, or you're good at that subject. Why don't you major in that in college? And they're disenchanted by almost the very things that they're good at. And I think that ties into what we've been talking about with being a noob, because I think as soon as you have an external label or a self-imposed label of proficiency in something is kind of when the mystery of it, the moreness of it kind of starts to dissipate. And so I think in a culture that is so kind of oriented around proficiency, quantitative success, in kind of a gamified way, as opposed to a culture that incentivizes exploration for exploration's sake. That is game B, in the game B world. People either get told it's kind of interesting because it's if you're told you're bad at something, obviously you're not going to want to keep doing it. But it's if you're told you're good at something, it's it often produces the same exact thing. Or you become like very hyper focused in that thing that you're good at. Like I remember listening to a podcast at some point where it was a therapist talking with like a extremely high level business executive who the only place he feels confident is talking to other business executives about his business. But like throw him into a concert or like I don't know, a speed dating like arena and he like falls apart. Um so I I think almost like the kind of meta skill of like almost being drawn to the like we if you're like self-aware enough you kind of know like the things that you struggle with. Like for me, for example, like I'm a very verbal person, but like um dispensing with my head and getting into my body in like a movement art is like something that is like a big edge for me. Why I'm taking Aikido lessons, for example. And it's like almost being like attracted to like pursue the things that are your edge because you know that that could lead to transformation is like I think a really important skill to engender in people. And I don't really know how to to teach that or to like cultivate that quality. But it seems like for me it kind of just started to develop um kind of naturally and organically, but certainly not in the school environment. I only wanted to do the things that I was good at so that I didn't get mocked or ridiculed or ostracized or shamed or whatever. So I think there's also um, kind of this like meta skill of like finding the beauty in the the stumbling and the struggling. Last thing before I pass it back, one thing that's like been really fascinating to me about learning about polymaths like uh Galileo or Pythagoras or Leibniz or a lesser known one, Emanuel Swedenborg, is that people who are like the most famous inventors, scientists, like known for their scientific breakthroughs are very often I've been hard pressed to find one that wasn't also philosophically inclined, like that had a deep philosophical life. Um, and that's always been interesting to me. And so I think there is this like, left brain, right brain, but I think even for these scientists, like I certainly think Einstein thought this way of like science science is like the English teacher who is exploring the mystery as opposed to arriving at some final answer that's unchangeable. Um, and we often look at those people and think, oh, they're such black sheep for thinking like that in a culture of that doesn't promote that. But I think that's also part of the problem is being like, oh, those people are just innately genius, and we don't really know how they got there. We don't really know how they thought like that, how they were just intrinsically motivated to learn. And I think that like then we're not really forced to think critically about actually how to design education systems that can promote that in all students. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
Exactly right. And I'll throw it to Kashir here before he runs. And I think that's exactly because the genius means you don't have to change the system. If it doesn't, there's nothing you can do, right? And so that becomes a way to sort of rationalize whatever the system is, right? Oh, and also if people are geniuses, they'll work regardless of the system. So they'll just come out, right? In fact, we should have a bad system because that will be more effective of sorting the geniuses from the bad, right? More could be said, and I really like what you were saying on the good versus bad. I think that's really important. The polymath did not think of that way. What they were bad at was what they needed to do versus the idea that we only do. If I'm bad at it, that means I need to work at it. But we don't think that way. But let me give it to Mr. Kashir. Mr. Kashir.
Yeah. So the speaker prior to Michael, was it Andrew? I don't know who it was, said something really brilliant about bringing together practitioners and various kinds of people in kind of like soft spaces. Christian, thank you. That felt really spot on to me. And the word that was on the tip of my tongue throughout everybody's shares was play. It seems to me that that is part of what's kind of essential to the art of the noob, and part of what the kind of meta noob, like meta practitioner is another word that I played with a few years ago, meta practitioner of the meta crisis, can bring to these groups of people who are compartmentalized in their knowledge. You know, they're very intellectually knowledgeable, or they have a lot of somatic and emotional knowledge, or whatever, but it's not being brought into wholeness. So, like, Dialogos is great for this. I think Dialogos is a great instance of the kind of practice space and play space that could do it, but there also has to be somehow other things woven in that are inducive and conducive to play. And there's also there's a lot of kind of sub layers in this matter related to healing. And where do we fall out of play and into defense or fight or flight, or just like we've fallen out of resonance and play and connection with others. And that's different for every person. But becoming more and more attuned to that process within ourselves and going through that again and again, such that we can then become the person who can hold the space that is safe to be unsafe in, and to fall out of resonance in, whilst holding a space of resonance. And I think that's a really key piece. And then the other side of it, of like spinning up these crews. Micro Solidarity talks a lot about crewing. They have a whole practice for this. I haven't done it yet, but it sounds fantastic. How to kind of spin up these groups which are emergent in nature, responsive maybe to an accelerating pace of change, and can kind of like bring something forth without then like ossifying into an institution as such. And another thing that Jordan pointed to in that podcast is, you know, there's a possibility that we're going to have to spin up and create new institutions altogether in the United States, for example. And so like the capacity for us to build institutions in the context of how do we get together in small groups, organize, how do we kind of come to an implicit constitution of how we do this, and the spirit behind that. I think all of that is super exciting and super key. So that's what I'm interested to do. And lastly, I want to give a shout out to Traditional Masculine Wisdom via Dr. Jordan Peterson, who, for all of the political stuff and all of the tweets and all of that, has had an enormous impact upon me over the years, especially in the articulation of these basic principles of like hero's journey. The way you become as a man is by going out into the world and doing things that are beyond yourself. If those things are too overwhelming, break them down into the smallest possible step, take that step. And gosh, that for me, like, I've been doing men's work for years. I've been in philosophy for years. Right now, I'm so fucking excited and like uplifted by the continual realization that that's actually true. And there's a gap between where I am and where I could be, and where we are and where we could be. But that gap can be bridged simply by applying ourselves to these uncomfortable situations that have a degree of play involved, and sticking to it. And so if I keep going to the fight gym, lo and behold, you know, it transforms my personhood. And if I go to the salsa class enough, you know, these come together. And this was the last point that I forgot that just came back in, is there's emergent properties that come out of all of this. And this is why we need meta practitioners and not just practitioners of X, Y, and Z, because something happens, something from doing music, something from doing live events organizing, something from your scholarly inquiry into medieval Europe, like all of it, like they come together and they have this, there's like an emergent possibility that is absolutely unique. And I thoroughly, thoroughly agree with what Christian said. We don't need a bunch of like liminal web metamodern superstars who are all advocating the same school of thought or variety of schools of thought. It's about the soul curriculum and the realization of soul through each person, through the multiplicity of things that excite the activation and realization of soul. And then what we can have is something like a soul tank rather than a think tank. But for that soul tank to be like intellectually rigorous, financially exciting, multifactorially creative, artistic, philosophical, agricultural, and various other things. And that to me is like that can change the whole cultural vibe. That can cause vibe shift at a deep level. And then it's kind of on God. I'll leave it there. And this has been fantastic. And I'm going to have to leave momentarily. But I really appreciate it. And I wish you a blessed conversation.
No, magnificent. Soul Tank with the soul I think that's very lovely. Well, again, what I've been thinking about, I think you're speaking to, is the polymath suggests an intellectual mode that almost we need to think in a sense the polyperson, where the polymath is like, I'm learning all these different things to be washed over. But what you're saying on this idea of doing salsa dancing and doing menswear, doing all of these different things, actually then creates a certain kind of subjectivity in the metaxis, betweenness of all of those different things. That is the condition in which something can jump out at you, which is resonant, which is tied to resonance, as you have spoken so well with Green about. And so there's something about resonance and polybeing, which I'll just use that term tied, kind of playing off the polymath, that seems to be the condition of this deep learning. Not merely this learning of information, but this thing grabs you and like, what Alcatraz, what is that? That then you're driven by, because once you have that experience of a certain mode of subjectivity that arises as a result of moving between these things, that experience itself grabs you and you go, what is this? And I want to know it more. And you keep doing more things. And so you are unfolding it more and more, which I would tie to Mr. Luber's idea of theme, because I think also what these polymaths are doing is actually finding a certain theme that is pulling them along versus simply a configuration of knowledge. Likewise, versus a configuration of being, you're finding the sort of thematic structure pulling you through being, or you're aligning with, but you require the multiplicity for that. And then thinking has to be in the service of keeping you in that motion, as opposed to becoming an end in its own right. But of course, if there is something that is necessary, and then I'll give it to Christian, then Luber, if there is something about the always becoming a noob that is spiritually necessary, then you always are going to have a going back to something you do that you haven't thought through entirely because you haven't done it, right? There's like that noobness almost necessarily puts a limit to thought, because how can you think about dancing if you've never danced? How can you think about rock climbing if you've never rock climbed? How can you think about these things unless you do them, right? And so if there's this sort of sending out that is required, that in order, what you're basically suggesting is you can't even think unless you do, right? Because you don't even, your quality of thought will lack this quality of the subject that emerges in the polybeing between all of these things. And if you don't have that, you can't bring it to thought. And that automatically means there's some sort of shallowness to thought or lack of humanness that is very consequential. I'll also say that Dr. Peterson's idea of breaking things down, I think, is extremely valuable and extremely important. And yeah, because if you're like, oh, well, I always like the Kaizen thing from Japan, like that one small step. If you want to start doing push-ups, start by doing one push-up. Don't do 10, do one. And do one for a week to the point where it's like embarrassing. And then the next week, do two. And those small little steps, I think, add up. But beautifully said. But let me give it to Christian here. Christian, please.
For me, Daniel, it was pull-ups rather than push-ups, and it's something I go back to and try to use to inspire people. because you run into it all the time, is that like people feel overwhelmed by the enormity of some type of new venture or learning, typically. Um, and I remember I was in I guess mid high school, 10th grade, something like this. And I was never a very athletic, in shape young man after like fifth grade. And then I couldn't do a single pull up. Um, and then I had a little bit of a embodiment awakening where I started playing football and shit like this. And I was like, I want to do pull-ups. And there was like a little exposed door jamb in my house. And I still couldn't do one, but I just tried to do one every day. So I didn't even have a one. I had less than one. But every day I would grab that bar and just like try to do a single one. And that in itself is enough. And I think that's important, is that like even less than one, just the effort in exerting yourself in the attempt builds the muscle. And it's actually, I think people will find that it doesn't take that long to get from I'm in accidentally quoting Peter Thiel, because I don't even know how he uses this term, but to get from 0 to 1. I have no idea what that term means. I know he wrote a book called that, but it happens to be the same semantics. Um, but yeah, and the term I typically use for that is titration. You have to titrate your experiences sometimes, no matter what. And that's basically the same concept of like, well, it's not always like chunking things down. It might be more like increasing or decreasing the exposure or the level of engagement or something like this. But basically, let's just say like a graded approach to something, a gradual approach. Uh, the so on this topic of um, yeah, by the way, Michael, uh, I think that's where I got that terminology from, because I found that true for myself, by the way, with somatics. I remember it's just a similar concept. I was working with some somatic therapy once, and I had all sorts of like problems with feeling in my body. And the therapist I was talking to was saying, okay, like, well, let's just like find that one place in your body where you do feel comfortable. And I was like, I can't find it. I don't know where it is. It took a while. It took a like kind of a melange of things to start slowly like figure out, how to start building that sense of connection to my body and comfort in my body. But yeah, titration is awesome and really important concept. So like I loved that Jacob brought up the concept of play. So I think that's super duper important. And uh, I remember like, and this might kind of be really on point with like kind of Jacob's interests here is I helped organize this meeting among farmers in my rural area. And we had a kind of like a third person facilitator who is a friend of mine and another farmer who works with like a land and water trust organization come in. She had some experience with like group led activities, and she wanted to have these farmers break out into small groups and have these kind of like interesting, productive chats about groundwater management. And when it got to that point in the meeting, and she's like, all right, so now we're gonna like break out in groups and like blah blah blah, and everyone just froze. It was just like, and no one moved and no one said anything. And it was like, this isn't going to happen. And one of the farmer's adult daughters was there with him. And she finally spoke up and broke the discomfort and said, "Hey, you're making us feel a little uncomfortable right now." And we all laughed, and we decided not to do small groups. But it just highlights that it's not an easy thing to get people into a state of play. You have to. I mean, you make yourself vulnerable when you get into a state of play, and a lot of people do not have a lot necessarily like proficiency with putting themselves in that state of mind. So I see this is, in my mind at least, it's like there's at least two different projects. One is like, how do you raise people and like kind of give them more of an earlier education or experiences such that they are more comfortable doing that. Um, but then as someone who refuses to like deny the urgency of facing pressing issues where we just have to kind of work with what we've got. There's also the question of like, okay, how can you kind of like, as best you can, bootstrap at least a semi-playful type of environment and mindset with a group. And I don't think it's an impossible project. I don't think it's not gonna be necessarily as great as you might hope and as like groovy as like kind of the playful conversations like in this group or other liminal web groups where I think we're all people who love deep playful conversation. It's kind of part of who we are. It's probably why we tend to congregate together. That's just not the case for everyone. So it's like, to me, it's like a really interesting problem to solve. It's like what's the kind of wizardry that you have to do to get people who are typically, especially if you're talking about an important subject, right, where people have a lot of emotional investment, people have a lot of maybe ego about their role or what they have to offer in addressing a problem, to like move a little further away from like the real super serious like this is frankly just probably have a ton of assumptions about what the right way to approach things are, and if you dare question those you're just going to ignite conflict and whatnot, into a place where they feel a little more comfortable exploring and playing and being receptive, basically. Again, though, I don't think it's impossible. I just think, and it's something I've thought about a lot, and I see certain pathways there, but I can't say that I've like run a bunch of like high level experiments to prove them out. But I do pray that that's something we'll see happen. It's something I'm actually going to try to push for. Uh, Anyways, I've got some really good connections right now in Arizona for people who facilitate these kinds of big think tanks, and I'm gonna see if I can sneak in some certain kind of social technologies to see if we can to make that happen, just to see how it works. I don't know, it might fail, but um, I'm pretty psyched on it. And then last thing, well, maybe I'll just for fun touch on that other side of it, which is like, how do we have people just be more open to states of play? And like I said, what prevents it is insecurity, and people are reluctant to become vulnerable and reluctant to have their beliefs challenged and to kind of like let go of like a totalizing framework of who they are and what is true and all of that, and get into a place where they can explore. Um, and so, if you really boil it down, it comes down to fear, right? I am afraid in some way, shape, or form. Um, I'm afraid of looking stupid. I'm afraid of having all the work I did on this thing and all my opinions be devalued, whatever. So, how do you get people over fear? And I think at least there's a lot there, but one thing that seems to me indispensable is that we somehow bring back into culture rites of passage. Um, like we need like it, I think is not just like a midlife thing that we should do. I think it should be like that's how you make your way into adulthood. And that's been true for so many cultures for so long. And I remember reading once, like, this is probably broadly true, but I only heard it like explicitly stated in one context. But they said, like, if you don't go through the rites of passage, we don't trust you as a member of the tribe. Why is that? It's because you're still compromised by your conditioning from childhood, your fears, your lack of kind of connection to the depths of your soul, the mystery of life, whatever, God. Um, so, but it's like, how do you do that in a multicultural society? How do you do that in a, whatever, very industrialized, capitalistic, get the next thing done, be productive? How do we bring that back? Um, and especially, how do we do it in a way that's not, it doesn't get compromised by ideology and bullshit? Because I often find that a lot of the people who get most energized about trying to do something like that are often the most kind of like ideological and take a little bit of a presumption of like, I know what the right way to do this is, and thus they are more confident in trying to actually do it, but then they're lacking the humility to explore that whole thing correctly. So anyways, there's that. How do we do it, guys? How do we get rites of passage back? It's so important. We must. And then the last point kind of follows from that, actually, which is like, okay, now how do we like continue that throughout life? How do we constantly, because it's stupid to assume that, you do one rite of passage when you're like, or whatever hero's journey type thing when you're 17, and that's just like gets you in shape for the rest of your life. No, you get reconditioned by culture. You get traumatized. You get, a fucking earthquake can put the fear back in you. I remember reading once that like in this culture in Central America, if someone scares you, like spooks you, like in a stupid way, you go talk to the shaman to like get that back out of your system. That's why I hate those fucking prank videos where they're like, I'm like, you're just fucking people up, and it's like for such a cheap, stupid laugh. I hate that shit. Anyway, personal little bear bug, whatever. Um, but no, I think we have to like constantly be going on that journey, like with some amount of regularity. And that obviously I don't have to tell you guys about the notion of ritual and that constant rebathing, not necessarily in culture or studies, but in the depths of the soul. That thing that like makes you feel humble, right? When you encounter the really deep, the really transcendent, the depth of mystery that forces you back into a beginner's mind, because you realize so immediately and deeply how limited your own thinking is. You're just like, I don't know what the fuck is going on. This is insane. I'm just floating. Like, maybe I know, I have a lot of ideas. I've spent a lot of time thinking, but who the fuck really knows? Like, to like constantly be bringing yourself back to that baseline, I think is so key to having that noob mindset. And the other thing I think those experiences do is it shows you where the it shows you like what to be more serious about. Um, it how do I say that? It There's nothing more serious than your connection with the divine, with mystery, with maybe a level higher with beauty, truth, and goodness, etc., which are transcendental things. They're not things you can necessarily capture in an ideology, but that is something that you relate to and are somehow know. When that is where your sense of like conviction lies, that allows you to less quickly put your convictions in all of the ideas and beliefs that we build on top of who we are, right? And then we're more flexible. Then we can play a little bit more, because the goal is not like I have the answer. The goal is beauty, truth, and goodness. It is soul. It is meaning, and that connection doesn't in, imply a specific belief set or idea or vision. It's an ongoing process of discovery. And so then when when you know that, when you're in a situation where you're challenged, you can fall back into that. And find your sense of stability in that, so that you don't feel so whatever, insecure in that process of exploring or changing.
No, absolutely magnificent. And yes, to rites of passages, as you said, and haunted houses are evil. You're doing these jump scares, and there are no freaking shamans for people. It's completely terrible. Excellently put. On that last thing you were saying, one of the things that, say, these kind of conversations or kind of regular philosophical discussion can do is it can also make you, one, as you're talking, you're like, I can't remember what I was about to say, or what book was that in, or what did Aristotle say? Like, you're constantly realizing how easily you forget things. You're constantly like realizing how, wow, I haven't actually read that thinker in a long time, or I forgot about that. There's this constant, in the very act of having a complicated conversation, there's also in the background a constant reminder to yourself of, oh, I actually don't know that much, or I've forgotten a lot, or there are things I'm trying to connect. So it's always very interesting to me where I find philosophical discussions have this interesting way of, yes, there's a whole lot of intellectual exchange, but there's also an experience with that of a humbling that comes to it in the people that are doing it, if you're actually genuinely seeking the mysterious. And I think that's really important. The other thing that's important with it is where, people talk about deconstruction, like their Christianity is deconstructed and they go into nihilism or different things. Well, there's a big difference between a deconstruction where you're alone and you're like, wow, if I stop believing Christianity, I lose my community, versus if you're in a discussion like this with people that make you say, question Christianity. Well, these people, you're not going to lose these people. Whereas a lot of people feel like they can't change their beliefs or adapt their beliefs without losing their family or their community. Where here, you can actually question these things, which humbles you. Oh, but people in philosophy also know that they don't know. So they usually don't actually go too far at the same time, right? Like, they're not going to take like anyone who does, in my opinion, you wouldn't, to say God doesn't exist. You might say God could exist or not exist, but you're not going to take that final step, because if you do philosophy, you see that there's arguments that lead to that, right? The point I'm saying is that what can also happen in discussions like this is you get that healthy humility of deconstruction that you actually need in this good way, without it being this crisis where atomized individuals undergo deconstruction, or people undergo deconstruction and then they're still in a Christian community and they feel like they're going to lose everything if they change it, or if they start asking questions, they'll lose everything. So to have spaces where you can actually be humbled or see, how you might be ideological and not feel like you could lose everything as a result, or that you'll be alone, that there are other people there, is also, I think, a very important kind of characteristic that is really important too, where and I guess what I'm saying with all of that, it's the side of where an intellectual conversation has an inherent, if it's done right, in my opinion, has an inherent humbling that is also part of it. That is keeping it from going too much in the direction, because it's almost like that is primary than solving all the problem, like the idea of solving the meta crisis or something like that. That regular experience of habituating yourself with people to remind you of those things, also for the cultivation of friendship, that all can be, I think, very, very powerful and very important. It has that ability to create a certain growth in you that is actually tied to a humbling, or this kind of idea that there's, wow, always so much more to know. Because I guess that's what the key characteristic that's so interesting of the polymath is. I think we read the history of the polymath and we see people that wanted to learn everything, or they wanted to, like, and some of them did, of course, but they wanted to be the masters of the universe. But really their motivation is often from this place of, wow, I don't know anything. There's so much to know, and I have to submerge myself in that realization of how little I know to find the thing that sparkles at me that I'll grab onto. It really is very interesting. I mean, the polymath has this contemplatio, this sort of prayerful kind of, they're learning everything, but the posture of it, again, has this kind of washing over for the thing that will grab you. The last thing I'll say, and then give it to Mr. Luber on this question of scaling, play. I think it is very fair to suggest that whatever this quality is that seems to be critical, perhaps is the meta solution in a sense, is play. Because again, a good philosophical discussion has a character of play to it. I think intrinsic motivation has a character of play. The work you're supposed to do has a quality of play. Like there's a real sense in which the thing that is human is playful, right? And play is an interesting word because you do a drama play, you do like an acting play, you imagine. The word play is tied with imagination. And it's also tied with this intellectual act and the body, right? You use your body to play. So the word play is very fascinating. And the question becomes how one may spread this. Well, there's a few things to this. There's signal sending. If there are people online who are having, say, playful intellectual conversations, and that gives permission to people. Oh, wait, there are people that do this. I'm not crazy to enjoy it. So it gives a permission to people that say it. You're sending a signal. There's also the threshold theory of sociological change, which is the idea that when you're starting something, you have to have your, Alex Ebert will talk about the Sasquatch, the Sasquatch dancing man, which is you have one guy that's doing a dance. Then you get a second guy, and then other people sitting on the hill who wouldn't have been the second guy, but they'll be the third guy if there's two other people doing it. And then if there's three doing it, there are some people that's enough to jump in, and eventually everyone on the mountain runs in. I think that is that's called the threshold theory of sociological change via signal sending. That seems to be valid. That seems to, Sasquatch blast mob. Exactly. The threshold theory of sociological change does seem to be correct. And one of the values of the social coordination mechanism, like we're doing now, liminal web, is it is a signal sending mechanism. It is a permissionary mechanism. It's like, it's okay to learn even if you're not a professor. It's okay to actually be interested in things even if you're not getting paid for it. It's okay to follow your interests. And actually there are other people doing it, so you're not crazy. And so you have a signal sending mechanism. The second thing, though, that can go along with that is event coordination, like you're doing. If you create spaces that enable people to play, events also create permission and help pass thresholds, right? Because you're creating, you have to be really smart to indirectly encourage people to play, for example. If you tell people, let's be playful, they'll never do it. How do you create an environment that, in a sense, tricks them into it or leads them into it, and then they're happy you did it, right? I think, honestly, because we are no good at design, we just kind of cheat with alcohol, honestly. I mean, alcohol, I'm not saying alcohol is bad, but it's a cheat because you don't have to design. We'll just numb people up, right? Again, I'm not saying, but we've cheated. We've used alcohol to avoid thinking in terms of how to design environments that lead people into that comfort, right? So you have event coordination, you have signal sending that can help with the threshold problem. I'll give it to, but it's a huge question. And then you could also say there are forcing functions on a larger scale that can make that can also accelerate passing thresholds. Because if what people are doing doesn't work, the economy stagnates, AI makes you lose your job, then you might go, well, I've lost everything, so why not play? Or it may make you open to trying different things because what has been done isn't working, right? So you have signal sending, you have event creation, and you have forcing functions that together can start making these kind of change. But you also then have to have the faithful presence of staying in the work to continue sending the signal, to continue creating the events. Because I do think the last thing I'll say is that I do think social change like this is more of an exponential curve than a linear curve. And the problem with exponential curves is for the majority of times, it looks like you're doing nothing. A linear curve, you have a constant sense of climb. Exponential is like this, and then it goes like this. And that does seem to be how culture changes. It is not very linear. It's nothing, 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 then bam, all at once. Because the famous example of the exponential curve is the famous question, if between noon and 1, you have a jar filling with little beads, and at 1 the jar is entirely filled, at what time is the jar halfway filled? Most people, a linear curve would be 12:30. An exponential curve, the answer is 12:59. 1 minute is when you have halfway up, right? And then bam, it's halfway there. And then of course it doubles at 12:01 and then et cetera, so forth, right? That seems to be how societies change. But of course that means until basically at 12:50, it looks like nothing's happening. At 12:51, it looks like nothing's happening. At 12:52, it kind of looks like something's happening. At 12, like all the way up until the last few minutes, it literally seems like nothing is occurring. And then, just like in the Sasquatch video, everyone comes running in all at the same time. And I do think it does seem to be the case that sociological changes have more of that character. But let me give it to Mr. Lubert. Mr. Lubert, it's good to see you 2 days in a row, my friend. I am thrilled.
It's always a pleasure, Daniel. Yeah, I jumped in kind of late, but I feel like I have a sense of the conversation. I just wanted to pose just like the classic like problem with sophists and sophistry. It seems like that's really relevant because um, this concept of like how to play, like learning to be a noob, I think is deeply contingent off of like the situation or the mentor or the teacher in which you're learning from, because I think you might keep falling into a ironic situation where you're a noob. It's like I did the Halo class and I'm still sucking at Halo. Like what the hell's going on? Where you kind of got like scammed in a way. And I just think like I don't know, like for example, like classes where it's like you take my course and in 6 weeks you will know what you need to know. You'll learn how to be a pro Halo player, let's say, like that seems like bullshit. And why stuff like that seems like bullshit is because uh like Heidegger talks about it's much harder to learn than it is to know. And like what he means by that is um what he means by that is basically to learn requires this like dynamic interplay with like how you're taking in the information and in such a way that it's like progressing you, but it's not making you fall back into the same pattern per se. So where knowledge, there's this like it's static. There is no falling back unless there's like a complete destruction where you then have to go back because it's like, well, I took the course, I now know how to be a pro Halo player, but now I'm playing pro Halo players and I'm getting absolutely owned and they're calling me noobs. Um, so like that seems like that that's not right. Like I was saying, the it does. Hey, I was really good at Halo 2 with if you remember the mods, if anyone played Halo 2, uh, really good at those mods. BXR, if anyone remembers. uh, but no, I just think the hard part is more not is the focus shouldn't be on whether like Street Fighter was cool. Street Fighter was really cool. Not as good. You'd probably kick my butt if that was your jam. I can't even imagine how good you were. Um, I just think the hard part isn't okay. Like how to learn to play. It's like how to learn from the right dynamic situation. Like not necessarily like the particular. I need to learn how to play X or Y, but um, how to play in general and like the problem like I think I forget who said it, he brought it up but like the meta shaman or the meta individual that like teaches the problem with that is so like the sophist. I feel like the sophist, that's when like sophistry can really come in and it can be dangerous because it's not attached to one singular thing. There's a lot of like life coaches on Instagram that it's like what you're saying is kind of empty and it's not really going to help and you're going to keep falling back on your ass kind of thing because you're not really getting in my opinion, with those type of individuals, you're not getting philosophical enough. Um, but I think it's. I'm not suggesting any answers at all because I don't. I'm really not sure. But like who you learn from, the situation in which you're learning out of, and being weary of sophists when you get into that general dimension of how to be. Um, I think if I had to give like a point of direction for it, it would be something along the lines of not necessarily like how much money they're making or how many clients they have, or like look at what look at what they have based off of what they claim to be. It's more, I guess, for me, like Desmond says this, like he talks about like you can just tell when something smells bad, and like it's really just about having a good nose, a good you smelling it out, and it's something that's so um, deeply personal, and I don't even think everyone has the ability to have a good sniff detector, because I don't think it's something that you could just like teach per se. But what's tragic about it, if that is the case, that means there's individuals that will go their entire lives, keep falling on their ass, keep putting themselves in a situation where the sophist is kind of teaching them and they're generating their quote unquote learning abilities in that dimension more. Um, I mean, yeah, maybe you just gotta read Heidegger. I don't know. But uh, no, I think like things like this, where maybe you're in a group situation and you're honest enough where um, people can challenge you. Like I think Daniel, you said it well, where it's like you're displaying a concept where the logic of that concept can deconstruct itself. Like that's when you know you have something that's probably more truthful, where you can use the very logic that's being taught to undermine the teaching itself, and like that seems to keep that open play. But I think yeah, I think that's an appropriate way of looking at it. Having a group where the group is working in a way where the logic itself isn't fixed, and that you can even undermine the logic in which the group is playing in, is probably a good sign. Might be frustrating for most, but that's, I think, that's probably the most appropriate step, where you're like, okay, I know I'm in a good situation where I'm learning in a healthy manner, and it's genuine learning, and I'm not just knowing things, because I am forgetting what I'm saying, and I am forgetting what I am knowing. And uh, yeah, I think how to spread that isn't easy in the society that we're in, because it might deem that your time is not efficient. You're not making money. You're not making something with your time, because it's always possible to basically undermine the purpose of what you're doing. And like that seems to be like not efficient in a capitalistic society. It seems stupid to most, honestly, if you were to say that to most people. But the funny thing is, those people that think that it's stupid, I would bet money that in 50 years from now, when they're old and life's passed by them, that they think how many things they did were so stupid. That's the funny thing, where I think people that are willing to use a logic that is able to undermine the logic itself might not live with regrets, and the risk in that is time. Time passes by, and then it's like, maybe actually I did still regret it. and then perhaps that still wasn't correct. I doubt it, but yeah, I guess the problem with the classic old age problem with the sophist comes in when we're talking about this like general sense of knowing. Because I think I'll just finish with this. When you have like a very particular field, it's very hard for you, I think, to point out like a sophist per se. When it's like, oh, you're going to a teacher that specializes in cursive, right? Like teaching you how to write cursive. Like it's pretty straightforward. Like there's not like bullshit cursive versus like real cursive. It's like it's cursive is cursive. Like, but when you get into this general sense, I forget what Plato dialogue he's talking about. Like he's like, oh, there's a speech. I can make the speech better because his speech is basically like sophistry bullshit. It might be the Phaedrus where he's talking about like write me a speech. Maybe I'm so shitty with names. But anyway, I'll pass it off. I think I made my point.
No, magnificent. And if anyone has any final things, I've enjoyed this evening, and I appreciate it on daylight savings time as well, which again, I always wonder about. But no, we do know our Instagram life coaching now because do what's stupid today so you don't feel stupid tomorrow. And for 3 payments of $100, we'll help you do what's stupid today so you don't feel stupid tomorrow. I think it's the way. But it is very funny. Like if you don't do that which you feel like, oh, I'll be seen as stupid, or what if I'm wasting time? It is very interesting where, like, if you don't ever do anything in your life that runs, well, I think actually this is true. If you never do anything in your life that as you do it, you wonder and worry if it's a waste of time or if it's stupid, that right there suggests a certain deficiency of courage that is necessary for one living a full life. Actually, like it is actually really important to do things in your life that you can, in a sense, justify according to the zeitgeist or the paradigm. And those are the things that actually, and we talked about it maybe 2 weeks ago, and I was mentioning this with Sam, Sam Green, with her story, The Mermaid. The areas in which you personally develop are those that the reasons for doing them have to be personal. And if you can give a reason for doing something, you might be doing it because it makes money, or because it's socially accepted, or because it gives you status, right? So then the development could just be an economic development or a status development. When you do something that you can't easily justify or you worry is stupid or whatever, then the development that occurs in that can be personal and clearly personal, because it's because the reason for doing it cannot be external from you as a person doing it. So it becomes a unique source of possible personal development, without which I think you are more likely to at the end have regrets, as you were noting. So what you fear is what comes unto you. If you're afraid of doing something stupid, then later on you can look back and feel how all of it was stupid because you never did that thing that you were afraid was stupid, right? There's some ironies there. I think also, well, what you're bringing up with the sophist, I'm just increasingly taken reading about the polymath, in the history of the polymath, how it is not merely a polymath is a guy who's an expert in a lot of things. It is a different theory of learning. Like it's a different theory of how humans best learn that is being suggested by the polymath. That, if true, is extremely important. The polymath is suggesting that, like you're saying, it is this movement between, well, it's what you were saying about the dynamic, this dynamic movement. That is what the polymath is all about in the 16th century. That is what they are suggesting, is that the polymath is, I think, without realizing it, basically living that distinction you're pointing out, Mr. Luber, between knowing and learning. And the polymath is like, it's not enough to know, we have to be learning. And that actually requires this saturation in all of these different things. And again, what's important, and I'll give it to Mr. Parsons, what's important about Burke is like this method of learning suggested by the polymath, we don't pay attention to and have forgotten because we usually remember our great thinkers as one thing. We remember Leibniz as a philosopher. not a expert on China, philosopher, and a lot of other things. We remember Thomas Jefferson as, say, an architect, not also a farmer, an inventor, president, etc., or a legal, a lawyer, etc., so forth, right? He gives 500 examples of people who are quite renowned that when we think back on them, he's like, we have this terrible tendency of categorizing a lot of our greatest minds in history, the people who have made these great changes. We think of them as a specialist because we only remember them for the thing they're famous for. We lose sight of this polymath way of life in the background of them that made them that specialist. That's kind of the secret, is that now I think we've tried to represent this by having general studies your first year at college, right? You go to college and you get rounded out, and that's nowhere close to what is being suggested. Like, it is not a full submersion. Let me the difference is this. When you go to college to get rounded out, you take the 101 classes. You take the basic concepts, right? That's not what the polymath is doing. They're drowning in they're drowning themselves in the most at the cutting edge debate and conversation being had in, say, biology. They don't understand. Here's the other thing that's very important. They may have no idea what is being said, and yet, nevertheless, they're going to drown themselves in it. And they're like, okay, I want to, and then they go and learn, right? They jump into the deep end first. Let's put it this way. This might be a better way to put it. When you go to college, you take 101 classes. The polymath starts in the PhD class. Like, they just start in the PhD class, and they look like an idiot, and they have no idea what's going on. It creates this submersion effect that is very, very important. And that means, well, this is important. It's thematic. That means they're always a noob. Like, they start a noob, right? Because they're always throwing themselves into the deep end. They don't start something and climb. They throw themselves into it. Now, of course, when they're learning a language, there's a lot of them that learn a lot of language. I'm not saying there isn't any sequence at all, but it is not I'm going to learn the general concepts and build up from there. It's like, no, I'm just going to throw myself into the lion's den of it. And that seems to be extremely important to this. But again, it introduces an entirely different theory of learning. That's what I'm finding so fascinated about the history of the polymath, is that there's a theory of learning there that blends together the generalist and the specialist. They're not either or, they're radically blended together in very profound ways. So this history of education, I think, is really interesting. But let me give it to Mr. Parsons. Mr. Parsons, please.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this polymath idea and how it seems like they kind of seemed like they were a time and place. I mean, there's some guys that are still out there that are quite significant, but it seems like we have like Ian McGilchrist or Vervaeke. It seems like they're still narrowed into an avenue, you know what I'm saying? And it's not an overall. It's almost like it was a type of spirit at the time. You know what I'm saying? A type of soul that was ability to do that at a time, and a time when maybe the information, wasn't as vast. But it seems like those polymaths then created avenues that we went specialized in. You know what I'm saying? And so there was a guardrails put on at that point that almost blinders in a way for us, and I've been just, going through the Catrone stuff with Cadell, and that's the big thing that Catrone sees with Marx, is that Marx really is just saying we're just at a impasse where there's so many contradictions arising that you can't make heads or tails of it. And it's not, we need to do both. We need to do what's best for workers, but we also need to do what's best for capital. We can't make the connections like these polymaths could at a time and place, it seems like. But it just seems like they were like, and so when you get in those guardrails, you're just locked in kind of the thinking and like the people that came before, the language that came before, and investing yourself in that. And so you're kind of trapped to where you think these polymaths, they just had like you're saying, this new beginner's mind, they're always going into fresh. They have a drive to, they don't care what other people think. And I mean, even if you look at some of the polymaths writings, like they're outstanding, and like, you have like Newton who's doing, but on the other side, his theology is like off the wall. It's crazy. So you're like, oh man, but they're doing so much. They're in so many avenues and so many hands. It's kind of interesting, but it just makes me think like they created like these avenues, but at the time it seemed freeing for us. It was a freedom and a way of being in the world, but it created a practice that then, like Hegel's vanishing mediator, we're locked into this framing, and it almost like we can't think. The polymaths were thinking, they had ability and like a playfulness that could go into practice, and then they could theorize, and they could even criticize, they could critique their own thinking and break out into new forms of thinking and have that ability. But it just seems like I'm just saying, with, I don't know if it's like Marx, but I mean, even after Marx, I mean, I'll stop with this, but it just seems like maybe like after that, we have these groups like the existentialists, or, the Heideggerians, or, you know what I'm saying? And these people that it's almost like we're doing the work together now. It's almost like we can't do polymath anymore. We have to do this together and create this thing together. And I think that's what, maybe we're going to do that better now with the internet, with these abilities. But I don't know. I'll just stop with that. But that's kind of some thoughts I have.
Outstanding. Well, the book, what I'm very interested with the book too, as Peter he certainly argues that the polymath has been lost. Like, it was lost. There was a kind of devolution in the 16th and 17th century to the Polymath by Pete Berger. Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir. So thank you for being here. And it's a fascinating book because he talks about it, kind of goes from the polymath to the man of letters, and there's kind of this drop-off that sort of occurs. The critical thing that I'm taking from the book that I want to expand on and think about is that polymath is a culture. Like, it requires a culture to create the polymath. It's not just the lone genius, because what ends up happening is as you move toward quantification, industrial revolution, and gradually and slowly, the idea is, well, why study all these things? Why wouldn't it be more efficient just to find the one thing you're really like Newton? Wouldn't it be more efficient not to do theology and just do physics, right? And what ended up happening is there was this idea of, can we cut the fat, right? Because the other thing is, many polymaths who were geniuses, they could be really dumb in another field, right? They could be studying geology, they could be studying Chinese, and they could be studying philosophy and actually be kind of dumb in geology. So it seems like, well, don't do geology. The book seems to suggest, although I'm not 100% sure because I haven't been finished it, I'm still writing through it and reading and going on different things. The impression I am getting from the book at this point, and I will have to write on because I want to bring it into conversation with belonging again, is the suggestion that no, that stuff that you think was fat was actually necessary. It actually, like, it may not seem like Newton's theology was necessary, but actually the theology worked on him in a manner that actually made him the kind of person who could do the Principia. Like, that seems crazy, but this is what is being suggested, is that all of the stuff that you think is fat is actually necessary. And also, definitely, like you're mentioning, Catron, definitely there's an idea that the polymath creates a certain kind of subjectivity in that culture that is much more flexible, much more nimble, much more noobish, much more willing to try new things, and that this creates different qualities of networks and relationships. But here's a key also characteristic. That culture was okay with, say, a 42-year-old starting and learning a new language, even if he never used it, just because he was interested. Like, people would not ask you, what are you going to use that for, right? And if a 42-year-old was stupid in geology, no one would, like, mock them. There was room to fail. You know how in Silicon Valley they say it's good to fail and all that different stuff, right? Like, failure is good. It means that's what an entrepreneur does. It really does seem in a polymath culture that's also cool. It's cool to fail at geology. It's cool to try to learn a language and fail at it. It's cool to make a fool of yourself as you try to talk philosophy with people in the French saloons or something like that, right? So there's a culture here that is the polymath. And that's what I'm finding very interesting. Like, the word polymath is coming for me to mean a cultural movement, not merely genius, not merely Renaissance man, not merely a man who knows many different fields. That's what the word has come to mean, but it really was a cultural movement that allowed a different form of subjectivity. You mentioned control. I cannot help but associate that form of subjectivity with freedom, with the ability to actually be free, to actually explore and to try new things and to move in and out of different modes of subjectivity. And the critical thing then is learning to create a polymath culture absolutely has real world consequences in terms of organization, politics, economics, how people meet. Like when we think about polymath as culture, it trickles down into everything. Like it is not merely an interest in philosophy, it is a certain culturation that has a different mode of consciousness. And so I think to me that has been increasingly fascinating on what is being suggested there. But let me give it, Mr. Parsons. Do you have anything else to say, sir?
I was just gonna say, like, that picture is like Catrone talks about the dictatorship of the proletariat, but that's what I'm like, that's the kind of spirit you have to have a dictatorship of the proletariat. Like it has to be filtering into everyone doing this together. I mean, I think that's what we're hinting at here, but but that's what, like, it doesn't with Catrone. Sometimes I'm like, he talks so much about the dictatorship of the proletariat, but it's like that's what it seems like has to happen for us, for the proletariat to advance like that. But
I mean, for me, absolutely. No, I think absolutely. I think like it would be another subject. And Tony at one time has talked about the Cultural Revolution in China, which, if we really view that as a genuine effort to give people, sovereignty over their decisions, where people eat themselves, they just eat themselves, right? That, like, we can hate capital and the system all we want, but actually it requires a mode of consciousness that is actually able to handle it. And the way that, and funny enough, we would associate seriousness as what we need to handle organizational sovereignty, or our own carrying ourselves in the world politically. But actually it's something more like play. Actually, it is certainly something more like play, and a certain flexibility and nimbleness of mind. I think that's also very important, because nimbleness of mind seems to be the quality encouraged. These are the qualities that are important versus, say, everyone reading Hegel or something like that, right? Reading Hegel could be something that generates flexibility of mind, but it is actually these characteristic of thought that translate into culture that is primary, right? If you don't live in a culture where you being a noob is not going to result in your parents being ashamed of you, then it's going to be hard to be a noob, and as you need to, right? And also, I mean, and I forgot to say, and then I'll give it to Christian here, the bet was that careerism could be the rite of passage. Like Francis Fukuyama in The End of History is like, well, we'll create a career structure, and getting a job, going to school, and having a career, that will be the rite of passage. That was the hope. But, Francis Fukuyama knew that the risk of Western neoliberalism, the Washington Consensus, was that it destroyed thymos in favor of logos and eros, and it absolutely did. And career is not a rite of passage, because it is not thymotic, and it's certainly not thymotic at the age that people need it. But that was the bet, and it was wrong, and now we're having to pick up the pieces of that mistaken bet. Not to say it didn't give us goods, but we're having to rethink it. And things like thymos, rites of passage, the culture of the polymath, these are all getting at, well, and actually, before I forget, also critically, I keep saying before I forget, forgive me, because I'm forgetting before I forget, et cetera, so forth. Another really key characteristic is so many of the polymaths were tinkerers. They were experimental. They're getting their hands dirty. Like a polymath was not simply a thinker. They were, well, they look at all of the Leonardo da Vinci with the helicopter and different, like there's a tinkering spirit in the polymath that is distinct from the ivory tower thinker. It's just so hard now. Like, we've placed philosophy and the humanities over here and the STEM over here. So philosophy is ivory tower, not getting your hands dirty, and the scientists are getting their hands dirty, the tinkerers, engineers. The polymath is a culture where they are absolutely together, where getting your hands dirty was actually part of the rub. But then you had a culture that was okay with people getting their hands dirty in their free time at a hobby to experiment, even if they wouldn't getting paid. I mean, you can't have polymaths as tinkerers if you're seen as stupid to get your hands dirty experimenting on something you're not getting paid for, right? Like, you had a culture with the polymath where people were just trying stuff. They were just tinkering. They were just coming up with blueprints for possibilities. And that was not seen as a waste of time or dumb just because you weren't getting acknowledged, right? There was this spirit of tinkering that was more culturally accepted. So there's a cultural element, but let me stop there and give it to Christian here. Christian, please.
Yeah, one thing I'm not sure about, I don't have an opinion because it's just a question, is like what what's the cost of polymathic pursuits? So I know a lot of the polymaths had patrons. So and when you try to like imagine someone today trying to be a polymath or want to play and get their hands dirty, it's like, can they afford it? And I think a lot of times it might be very difficult, if at all possible. You only have so many free hours. You've got a family to take care of, etc. Um, I'm looking forward to kind of moving into a family kind of more oriented lifestyle, but I also realize that that is going to cut out a lot of my polymathic affordances. Like I just won't be able to do as much broad, diverse, interest pursuing that I get to do now. So I'm kind of like trying to get a lot done right now while I still can. Um, but I'm just kind of like building on what's already been said here, mostly from Andrew and earlier Jacob, um, and myself too. But it, I wonder if the the rather than like let's make America polymathic again, there's a certain like new way to approach this. I just say that in jest. I'm not like putting it, yeah. Um, and I don't know what you would call it, metamath culture or something. But uh, so as Andrew pointed out, like I think once upon a time it was a little bit easier to be polymathic, also because you could kind of um, feel like you were making progress in kind of knowing where the edge, culturally speaking, of a field of study is at, with way less investment of your time. So that made it, you have more time to spread across more things, and you were already kind of like caught up with like, here's where the conversation is. Whereas Andrew pointed out today, we've gone so deep down all these paths of specialization that the investment cost is way higher to get yourself to the point where you can feel like you're at the edge. So maybe the way to reintroduce, maybe among other possible ways, but one way to reintroduce the polymathic culture is, and I'm restating what I said a little bit, but just adding this color to it, uh, is that well, let me add one quick ingredient. I don't know if I heard this somewhere or if it's something I just kind of like put together over the years, but when people master some kind of domain, whether that's studying, whether that's baseball or ping pong or raising children or whatever the hell it is, when you like really get deep into it and have some level of mastery, I think it's typical that you gain wisdom, which is then applicable to other domains. And I don't know if this is what you were kind of implying earlier, Daniel, but when we talk about this kind of like way of thinking, where you're even if you're dumb, you're kind of dumb at something, you've gained something from studying something else and whatever. And I kind of assume that this is because when we learn different things, we're creating different models, like very distinct kinds of modeling, which then create these affordances for insight, basically. Like I can take my theory of how a baseball team operates and draw some of those concepts and apply them to how my work team operates, or how my computer program that I'm programming operates, or whatever, right? And so let's at least say in certain situations where you can't have necessarily a bunch of actual polymaths, but you do have a bunch of people who are just kind of, one or two lane specialists. How do you make that polymathic insight afforded to different people? And maybe there's like a role, a specialized role there where some people, part of it may be just creating the right context and environments for people to be more open and all of that, but also doing a little bit of the translation work, right? Someone who's, because I feel like some people more quickly, at least I know like I'm this way, and it's why I like diving into the deep end first. It's because even before I know what the fuck I'm talking about, I kind of like feel what a body of knowledge is about. Like I have a sense of like the edges, and I'm like, oh, I see, I know, yeah, I'm grokking something here. I can't tell you much about it, but I feel it. And so people with those skills, I think, are going to be quicker to, even at a somewhat shallow exposure to some domain of thought that they might not otherwise know anything about, can start to like draw like some of those insights, because that's what their brains are good at. And then within the context of like a cooperative conversation, start to uh, help the other people think in these different ways. And that might be part of it. It also might just be like creating an environment where the person who has their wisdom from their specialization feels comfortable saying to the other person with their specialization, instead of staying in their lane, saying, oh, well, what that makes me think is, and then they have a unique insight that that person doesn't have because they have this whole other modeling system. But so often we're not comfortable doing that because we don't want to offend them and telling them like, maybe you don't have this insight, and also I don't want to feel stupid because I might be totally wrong and you might. But creating that where you're kind of creating a collective intelligence, basically, where each person is like one of those polymathic pillars, but now we've brought those pillars together, created a group polymathic brain where you get the affordances of a polymathic brain. And thanks for this conversation. It's been a great one.
Well, it is a delight. Thank you for being here. I think what you just said is extremely important. I think there is something about the polymathic, if you will, or the polymathic culture that invites analogy, analogous thinking. And if Hofstadter and all of these classics are basically like, hey, all thought is actually analogy, then a culture that makes space for or invites analogous thinking is actually going to invite really a development of thought that is extremely powerful and very important. Because I think what you're saying, when you're a noob and you enter into a field, you can bring a certain ability to feel and to shape, and you're using analogy. You're making it more geometrical. You're making it more of a shape. And if analogy is at the root, following a Hofstadter and all these people, of all thought, basically, then the better we get at analogy, or the more we culturally allow analogy. Like if you're have different people of different fields enter in, well, then you kind of expect them to use analogy to get a handle on it, right? You expect them to go to metaphor and simile in ways, and you encourage that, right? Well, that right now, basically, we're skeptical of analogy, where we don't like analogy in our specialization. We don't like metaphor. We don't like framing things, right? Well, that actually then has us identify the fullness of thought in that which is not thought, because all thought is analogous. I know that's a giant claim, but I think it is certainly the case. All thought is likeness. Like no thought is an equal sign. We're always getting at things, never fully arriving at them. We're always dealing with models. And language is all analogous. It's not definition, right? So what ends up happening when you have a more polymathic culture is you have a culture that invites thinking that is analogous. And this is also important because analogy combines imagination and rationality. And this keeps rationality from being autonomous, and it keeps imagination from being separate from intellectual life. And when you combine the rational and the imaginative, I think you get play, because play is a mixture of imagination and structure. So analogy is playful, but it's also very serious. Oh, it's kind of like, oh, I see the shape. Oh, it's like this field. There's a playful move in the analogy, but it's also very serious because we're getting at what the thing is. Everything you said, absolutely. The economic restraints on the polymath got in the way. The polymath culture did not spread for good reason. There's good reason it didn't spread, and also there was the real danger that it really did occur that polymaths would master many polymaths may start a bunch of projects, never finish them. They may know a lot of things and be kind of shallow here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there were risks to the culture that invited an efficiency critique and an elitism critique, but there's something about the polymathic culture that even today, people, when they're retired and they have money, they don't tend to go into a polymathic way of life. That is very, like, even people with money are not polymaths anymore. And that's a cultural, we don't value the polymathic lifestyle. Of course, it tended to be restricted to people with money, but even people with money now don't choose that lifestyle. That's, they're, unless they teach at a college or something like that, right? They may have hobbies and they may read a book they find interesting and dabble in. They might be dabbling in some different things, but an actual all-in polymath that we're saying with Burke and creating networks. Another key characteristic is like the French salons, like people are not actively in retirement who have money creating networks of polymaths. The closest you may see is a reading group that usually die out and not many people do it, right? So I don't mean to say that there are no efforts at all, but a culture of the polymath is not there. It is not valued. We do not associate elitism with being a polymath, or we do not associate a good use of retirement with being a polymath. Elitism is being a specialist, being an expert, or things like that. So there's a cultural shift toward a certain mode of consciousness and subjectivity away from another. However, that doesn't change the fact polyvacant and polycocky. Yeah, that's exactly right. There you go. Well, actually, there is Emerson once warned that travel was dangerous and that there could be a certain drunkenness with experience and travel. And I do think that's what we see today, this kind of drunkenness on traveling. Traveling is good, but when it becomes a certain tourism, there's a French philosopher, I can't remember who said it. He said, basically, we have a new barbaricism today in tourism because the barbarian comes into your home, takes what they want, and they leave. That's how most people do, right? That's, and that's what we value. We value gaining experience and consuming, not becoming a polymath, right? So that's a very problematic cultural shift, but it's also in some respects understandable because of the economic constraints, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Very fair. Again, what I just increasingly, and then I'll close and run because I guess it's actually 11:30 instead of 10:30. Gosh darn it, the time switch. Is that what's so interesting is this idea of in a polymathic culture, you get experts in the polymathic. They emerge. It's like the expert or the specialist emerges from the polymathic culture. Whereas today, when we focus on specialization, it's like you calculate your way into becoming a specialist because you take this track and you end up this way. What's interesting in the polymathic culture, it's almost, yeah, they had specialists, they had experts, people who were better in this than versus not, but it was almost as if that emerges. You don't know, you don't realize you're going to be an expert geologist, and then one day you find yourself one. And then I guess this is really critical. Then the line between calling and specialist was thin. When you emerge to your specialty, it can feel like a calling, actually. It can feel like this is what I'm supposed to do. It's almost picked me more than me picked it because it's emerged in me. That creates a very different relationship to work that is, well, more meaningful, honestly, where people now can feel like their work doesn't have meaning because they chose it when they were 18 and they had to pick something and they got this master's or whatever by 24 and then it turns out at 30 they don't like it, right? But it's too late, right? Like there's this kind of sense that you pick your mastery arbitrarily and too young, right? And simply based on what you enjoy doing. So it doesn't emerge. It doesn't feel like a calling for a lot of people, right? I am taken by this idea of this kind of and I keep saying this polymathic culture where people, when they become specialist, it's something that almost emerges upon that emerges and then is experienced like a calling, which is that I think brings us back to intrinsic motivation and the things that we were talking about. We don't have a school system or a society by which people's specialization feels like a calling to them. It might. I'm not saying that's for everyone, but it's less likely because it is not the result of a emergent and mysterious overflow and overhearing where they just go, huh? What's Alcatraz? That thus makes it feel bigger than themselves, pulling them along. And I think that has a big effect on subjectivity that limits possibilities socially, economically, in our meetings with farmers, meetings with neighbors, and in retirement. It's been a delight, friends. Thank you so much this evening. I appreciate it. Wonderful
Thanks,
to see
Jay.
you, Christian.
Take care, y'all.
You too,
Yep.
Christian. Andrew, thank you
Night.
so much. Y'all have a good evening. All the best to you.